Hi, everybody. It's Birb agent speaking. Welcome to today's episode of the National Podcast. In all honesty, we've had many guests. However, most of them actually happen always to be traders, investors, analysts. And well, today we have a kind of like a different form of analysis right in front of our eyes to appear because I'm talking today to my special guest who happens to be Daniel Batten. And Daniel is just following his Twitter bio a Bitcoin environmental analyst. In all honesty, whatever that means, because I am yet to discover as much as you guys are what that truly means to be a Bitcoin environmental analyst. He really speaks in favors and well on behalf of climate tech VC, as far as I understand, as much as he's also a coach and advisor and a person by whom I got truly inspired about, well, leaning towards Bitcoin versus environment. This is never something that I actually just approached. This is a very underrated topic, so I'm happy to talk to my today's guest, Daniel Batten, about this. Daniel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Great to be on the show. Thanks for having me on here.
I love that. And, I, of course, did my best to follow just a very brief and sweet intro that you happen to have on your Twitter bio. And for all the notice, you guys can find Daniel right away at DS Button, at DS Button on Twitter. So go rush ahead and already click the follow button. You won't definitely miss any tweets of his anymore. But Daniel, tell me a little bit about your brief story. How did it happen for you to actually get in the field of Bitcoin environmental analytics?
Well, I was really following a personal question that I wanted an answer to. And I'm someone who's cared about the environment deeply for a long time. I've been an investor for a long time as well. I got interested in Bitcoin in 2017. I almost sold my Bitcoin in 2017 because I read some mainstream news articles about it being bad for the environment. Fortunately, I had a friend in the Bitcoin community who was able to say, why don't you check out this video from Andreas Antonopoulos first? And I did, and he was talking about how Bitcoin helped the renewable build out of the grid. And that made a whole lot of sense to me. I wasn't 100% convinced one way or the other, but it was enough for me to stay in the game. So I stayed in Bitcoin. But I always had this question mark looming. It was like, for a later day, check out, really, is it net positive? Is it net negative? Is it somewhere in the middle? And I had my environmentalist friends who are saying that it's terrible for the environment. It's going to boil the oceans and the usual stuff. I had my Bitcoin friends telling me it's wonderful for the environment. It helps build out the renewable grid. And I thought, you can't both be right. And I just became interested as someone who was both an environmentalist and who had become a Bitcoiner to work this out for myself. And particularly in 2021, when we had these three major events that happened for Bitcoin that were all climate related. We had Elon Musk saying that it uses too much energy and he's out. He's going to not allow people to buy their Teslas using Bitcoin anymore. We had China. Now, some people say that it wasn't really the environment they were concerned about. They just wanted to have more central control. But their stated official reason was we need to lower our emissions. We want to ban Bitcoin mining. So that was climate related. And then the third issue, just before that, remember, of course, as I'm sure you'll remember all too well, is we had what Willy Woo called tripping the power cord, where it went offline. This major gas plant or coal plant in China. But the reason, if you follow why that happened, it went offline because of flooding, and that flooding was due to extreme climate events. So we had three climate-related stories that all had a major impact on Bitcoin price in 1 year. So I was very interested to, and that's one of the reasons I think that everyone who's interested in Bitcoin should be following it should be interested in the story about the environment, because if you're not, then when people come at you with these comments such as it's terrible for the environment, you really need to be informed enough so that you can educate people and say, well, I understand why you'd say that, but actually it's not the truth. What you're reading is probably the result of reading a mainstream news article, just like I did. And if you trace it right back to origin, you come to a single site, which is put out by a central banker who has an obviously vested interest there, who is putting out information about Bitcoin, which has actually been debunked by neutral third parties, i.e. Cambridge University. Not many people know that. Unfortunately, we live in an age where there's not a great deal of investigative journalism that happens. So we're relying on these mainstream news reports, which is probably one of the reasons that most Bitcoiners don't read them, because they've understood that they're so unreliable in so many ways. So I knew I couldn't rely on them. I had to do my own research. And I put on my analyst hat and I thought, well, I'm going to have to go back to doing some maths and doing some chemistry, understanding how grids work, understanding how Bitcoin can use methane and burn it, and whether that's good for the environment, whether it's bad. And I really just went deep down the rabbit hole, but it wasn't the rabbit hole of understanding how Bitcoin can change the global economy or become the new financial system. It was a rabbit hole of understanding its impact on the environment. And for me, that was just as important as its social and its economic use case. And the conclusions I came up with, like I said, I was expecting to find that it was somewhere in the middle. That wasn't what I found. What I found, to my surprise, was that it was a net positive for the environment, even to a greater extent than the Bitcoin mining operators themselves had been saying. Which just blew me away. And so I became very excited about it. And as someone who likes to communicate, particularly ideas that are complex, and try and put complex ideas into simple language, I thought, well, I've really got a responsibility to start sharing some of what I've learned. And I started doing that. And unexpected to me, that led to a whole lot of opportunities to interviews and Twitter following and all the rest of it, and a path that I'm now leading down. We're even looking at putting together a Bitcoin mining fund specializing in funding people who are going to make the Bitcoin network more carbon neutral, because this is its absolute future. In fact, even carbon negative.
Whoa, that's already quite a chunk of an interesting piece of a story, in all honesty, right? And I'm just looking right now at your Twitter account, and you happen to be very close to 10,000 followers. So I hope that everybody following this very podcast on our YouTube or elsewhere, that all of them are definitely going to rush over to break this 10,000 followers milestone for yours. So yeah, like I said, there is this date, marked as in joined September 2009. So how beautiful would have that been, to actually join at that time for Bitcoin. But being in 2022, we have so many already, I think, people who are getting more and more interested, and I'm talking about high level people, as in the governors, right? We are looking at lots of actually bills and legal resolutions actually being implemented or voted over these very days, right? Be it within EU, be it elsewhere. Myself, originating from Poland, we are very relatively, I should say, behind, and have a lot of catching up to do. However, there are some more leading countries within the European zone or elsewhere, in all honesty, that of course lean toward mining and its overall sustainability. So taking it further to an overall discussion, Daniel, about Bitcoin versus environment, right? The question is, myself being a trader, I've never truly kind of like, stopped for a moment, having so much heat, to actually consider whether or not what I do about Bitcoin, or whether or not how I trade it, how fast I trade it, how high frequency of my trading is, how much of a of network usage it actually takes, what it does to the environment. So my question is, what does Bitcoin do to the environment in your take?
Yeah, for me, it's not a Bitcoin versus the environment. It's a Bitcoin versus disinformation about the environment. And because in fact, if you look at Bitcoin overall, what's fascinating about it is the proof of work algorithm is actually what gives it the potential to become a carbon negative network. So until now, we've had this very one-dimensional view of energy. And that is that from an environmental point of view, we want to reduce energy. We want to reduce energy consumption. More energy consumption is bad and less energy consumption is good. But obviously that's not true. That depends on the source of energy. Now, if that energy is coal, then yeah, we want to be doing less of that. Natural gas, less of that. But what if it's solar? What if it's wind? And what if by using that solar or wind energy, you are helping a solar operator who in America right now might spend anywhere between 2 and 5 years trying to get onto the grid, been unprofitable in the meantime, been in this huge interconnection queue, and you can provide that solar operator with their first customer before they get onto the grid. Therefore, you're helping them be more profitable. Therefore, you're helping them to get capital because now when they go for funding, they've actually got a source of revenue. So they're way more likely to get capital. Because they're likely to get capital, they're also likely to get their grid application approved and get it approved earlier. And because they've got this Bitcoin customer who has been absorbing that solar or wind energy in the meantime, they become profitable earlier and they reabsorb those profits into building out and increasing their facilities. So it's incredibly positive. At the same time as finding a home for solar and wind on the grid, it also has this incredible ability to be able to curtail in a heartbeat. And no other technology, no other user electricity can do that, not to the degree Bitcoin can, when it can within seconds. It can curtail its usage, but not just curtail it, but curtail it to the precise levels that grid operators require in order to do the very complex and increasingly complex job of keeping a grid stable, where now you not only have variable usage, but you also have variable generation, because you cannot predict how much generation will be available on a given day based on the weather conditions when you've got an increasingly renewable grid versus in the old days when it was predominantly fossil fuel based and you could just tell someone to put some more coal in the burner and crank it up and generate more. You can't do that. You can't ask the sun to pump harder today. So Bitcoin has an incredible role to play in helping to build out the renewable grid, number one. And number two, helping to stabilize the intermittency of renewable energy. So that's the first part. Now, there's an even more exciting part in my mind, though, than that, because what that can do, that's fantastic. It can help the renewable transition. We also have a challenge, though, because that's not the view the White House has arrived at. Unfortunately, the White House has arrived in their report at a much more simplistic view, which is, sure, we know that Bitcoin will help with demand response, and we can know that it can taper down its usage when it reaches certain peaks. But then they go in and make this terrible mistake and they say, but Bitcoin is responsible for having us reach those peaks in the first place because they're using so much energy. And the bit they unilaterally fail to understand is the piece that there is more solar, there is more wind on the grid because of Bitcoin in the first place, number one. And number two, it's non-rival. It's not using energy at the same time as other people because it's not in your economic incentives. Why would you mine Bitcoin when it's at peak demand and suddenly wholesale electricity prices have spiked so much that it's unprofitable? You have an inbuilt economic incentive to play nice and it's like using the road. Imagine this, it's like a road user who comes along and the most benevolent road user you can say and says, hey, your state highway is congested right now. Well, how about we give you some money so you can build an extra 2 lanes on this highway and extend it from a 5-lane highway into a 7-lane highway? And the roading operator says, that sounds fantastic. What's the catch? And you say, well, the only catch is we want to use the highway too. And they say, well, isn't that going to clog it up again? And they say, well, no, it's not, because we're only going to use it between peak hours. And the moment that it becomes peak hour, we're going to pull over to the shoulder of the road like that. So you get this bigger capacity, this bigger highway, this bigger grid, which has more capacity for everyone in the first place because of Bitcoin sponsoring the renewable build out, number one. And then number two, it has the ability to instantly pull over to the shoulder and get off the grid when other people need it. So it's a phenomenally benevolent user. Now, like I say, that's not the conclusion the White House report has arrived at. So we have a challenge there. And part of the challenge is communicating that message. The benefit of the report that did come out just today, though, where they got it right, was they acknowledged that when you're using vented methane as a source, it's an environmental net positive. Now, what does that mean? What's vented methane? Are we talking about taking it from cows? No. We're talking about taking it from sources where it's easily usable for generation. And that is orphaned oil wells. Oil wells that have just been left. No one knows who owns them in some cases. millions in the United States alone, estimated to be 30 million in the world, leaching methane into the atmosphere. Landfills, same thing, leaching massive quantities of methane into the atmosphere, millions upon millions of tons of a gas which is 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide, and which the United Nations Environment Program came out last year and said methane represents the strongest lever we have to curb climate change in the next 25 years, which is an incredible statement. So, okay, the United Nations Environment Program has said that reducing methane levels is our top priority for the next 25 years. Not carbon dioxide emissions. Yes, that's super important. We have to do that as well. But methane is our number one priority because it's 84 times more warming to the earth. Okay. And then you have Bitcoin mining, who has this unique ability to use this methane and to capture it and combust it. And when it combusts it, there is a byproduct of carbon dioxide. And you might think, well, that doesn't sound good, but it's great because the net emission difference, and this is what the White House government report recognized, the net benefit is so large because you're mitigating a gas which is 84 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So it's a massive net positive. It's a recognized form of carbon capture. And it means that the more that we power the Bitcoin network off these carbon negative sources, vented methane, we can actually reach a zero emission entire network by my estimates, the fourth quarter of 2024. So that's how net positive it is. It's just a phenomenal story.
Well, I mean, as I was listening to talk about this, I mean, it not only makes this impression that you are very enthusiastic about this topic as a whole, but it also does give this impression that there are lots of myths that we all have to break down as cryptocurrency enthusiasts somehow, or the supporters in a way, right? And well, funnily enough, I'm a chemical engineer for my leading background, right? So I remember kind of like talking about methane, carbon dioxide, kind of like
so you get this stuff,
yeah. I mean, at least just of the surface, right? But as far as I understand and as far as I see, that just like we mentioned briefly, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of myths about not only carbon dioxide, about this different, I should say, misled approach to the climate change, right? There is probably some cyclicality to it, right? There are some volcano eruptions which commit to a lot of pollution in the air, right? Which is often mistaken and misused in a, I should say, misleading manner, to kind of like mislead a lot of people, again, build certain false narratives. I don't know about where we can go with Bitcoin in terms of landing into the very specific connection that you mentioned, right? Because on one side, we're talking about Bitcoin having this capacity, this overall possibility to fight, to tackle down the amounts of methane in the air by utilizing it that in its own good purpose, as far as I understand, right? And on the other hand, we would have the governors who would try to rule out, for their own benefits, more likely than not, which happens to be true a lot. And we have this very apparent bridge, as far as I understand, right, that can be utilized, but it's very misunderstood by a lot of people, especially who happen to be ruling, and passing the bills. So if you allow, there is this very interesting thread I wanted to actually just proceed to move to from your side. And this is actually one of the reasons I happen to be inspired to get you on the podcast, and I'm very thankful for it. And this is this great, amazing thread that caught my attention. Of course, that went viral. Congratulations on that. And let me quote to you, ladies and gentlemen, from Daniel Batten. 1 out of 10. This is a longer thread, so go and check it out. Definitely, it's pinned under his profile, and I quote, "This chart says Bitcoin is even better for the environment that we fought, right? And we have this estimated carbon footprint. We have coal on the scale: coal, natural gas, solar, nuclear, wind, ocean, hydro, and then we get on the negative side, mitigating flared methane, mitigating vented methane, which is something that we briefly talked upon, right? But if we go and dive a little bit further, then you're saying, in fact, Bitcoin mining of vented methane takes 13 times more emissions out of the environment than coal puts into it. So talk to me a little bit about that. How do we actually just take it?
Yeah. So it's all, you get these extraordinary numbers for a couple of reasons. Number one, it takes a lot of methane to produce a single megawatt of electricity, which is good in terms of the environment, because you take a lot of methane out of the environment to produce power. And the second reason that you get these huge numbers, like 13 times as good as coal is not so great, is because of that 84 times multiplier. So it's 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a global warming gas over a 20-year period. And so you look at the maths, and you have to factor in that when you burn methane, you don't get equivalent amount of carbon dioxide, you get 2.75 times as much. Then you have to factor in the little bit of residue that's still left of methane after you combust it. And then you have to factor in how much methane would have got into the environment. You do the chemistry, you do the maths, and what it comes out is that it's 13 times more powerful as a mitigator, in terms of, if you had let that methane go directly into the atmosphere, the quantity of methane that would have gone in there relative to the quantity of what we call carbon dioxide equivalents that go in if you burn it, which is tiny, and then you take the difference between what would have gone into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide equivalents versus what does when you use it for combustion, and that difference is the carbon negative factor. And what's important to point out here is this isn't accounting. This isn't carbon offset accounting, which people often criticize. This is chemistry. This is mathematics. This is a recognized way of calculating the carbon negative factor. It's recognized by the EPA. It's recognized by Trillium Energy, recognized by carboncapture.com. It's been done for a long time. So methane capture and combustion has been recognized as carbon capture, as net positive for the environment, as carbon negative pre-Bitcoin. The problem has been that whilst it's had this theoretical potential, there's been no potential user, because the problem is, who wants to put their building or their industry right next to a landfill, or right next to a sewage pond, or right next to a farm? And there's typically no grid infrastructure. And often people say, well, can't you just put it into the grid? Well, the problem there is we live in a wireless age when it comes to the internet, but we don't live in a wireless age when it comes to electricity. We need wires. And so those wires are the grid, and those wires can cost hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars per mile to build out the pylons that are required to transport that power. So if you start to do the maths on this, and that's one thing I did as an investor, there's no way that it makes economic sense in most cases to be able to transport that power, because you're paying much more in infrastructure than you get through the mining revenue, or through any revenue that you use that power for. So in that chart where I've looked at the different ways you could use that methane, there's only one that stacks up, and you can look at edge data centers. You can use it for hydrogen. Can you use it for EVs? Can you use it for all the usual suspects? And sometimes people say, oh, we should just flare it. We should just burn it. We have these wonderful things called flares. No, we have these terrible things called flares that only burn 92% of the methane, and that's when they're lit. They have a tendency to go out. Often they're used as virtue signaling. So you have a landfill that has the capacity to generate 10 megawatts of power, but the flare stack's only burning 1/5 of that. It's out a lot of the time. And it costs $1 million to put in, and $100,000 per year in maintenance costs. And it provides no revenue in return. It's all expense, no revenue. And it's not even doing its job of removing methane properly. And it also puts soot into the air, which has its own climate change implications and its own pollution implications. So that's one of the worst solutions. And you boil it all down, and Bitcoin mining actually turns out to be the only way that you can effectively, economically, scalably take advantage of this wasted, stranded, carbon negative energy that's coming out of these landfills or these wastewater treatment ponds by the megaton.
Whoa. I'm blown away as you speak about that.
And I've got to say, like sometimes people say, well, surely it can, but here's the thing: we're running a methane mitigation fund, and so we are climate VCs first, and Bitcoin is second. In other words, whilst we're incredibly enthusiastic about Bitcoin and its potential to mitigate methane, if we find something that can do it even better, then we have a fiduciary duty and an environmental duty to use that instead. So much as we love everything Bitcoin can do, we're ultimately agnostic about the technology. So we find another cryptocurrency that can do it better. It's got to be using proof of work, it turns out, because that's the only one that uses enough energy to be able to mine these carbon negative sources of energy effectively. Then when we'll use that, if we can find that there's an edge data center that you can use and that does the job better, we'll use that. We would prefer that there were actually more potential users of this carbon negative energy because it de-risks our fund. And we have to look at every use case. We have to say, well, what happens if Bitcoin goes down in value to some ridiculously low point and it's no longer economical to mine? What will we do instead? And we have to look at these disaster recovery plans. And it's possible you can get other users, but it's really messy. And in my chats with other people who are climate tech VCs, they all say the same thing. Everyone who understands the unique use and the unique way that Bitcoin is interruptible and location agnostic and is really the only one who can profitably use these stranded sources of energy, such as vented methane, that's wreaking environmental havoc right now. They all came to the same conclusion that Bitcoin mining is not just the best, but the best by an order of magnitude. In fact, it's the only one that makes economic sense. And all the other backup plans are really ugly.
Oh, this is especially when especially when you make this pause, it kind of like lets all my thoughts kind of like aggregate and run through my brain as I process that. And I'm getting more and more inspired. so excuse me if I kind of smile too much.
Like I say, I wasn't expecting to find this when I did the research. I was incredibly surprised, and I'm not the only one who's come to these conclusions. If you look, one thing that happened along the journey was, as I started to talk about the value of landfills, and I was talking about it theoretically, what I didn't realize was that someone was already a step ahead of me, and that was Vespine, and they were already doing it. They'd already seen this opportunity 2 years before me. And not only had they seen it, but they built a company around it. And not only had they built a company around it, but they were on the point of raising capital. And they shared what they were doing, and I had a look at what they were doing, and I thought it sounded amazing. And the numbers they were coming up with were absolutely identical. The calculations, the amount of methane that it could mitigate, the environmental good that it could do, they were coming up with identical numbers. And the reason is that the maths is actually not that hard. It's quite hard to calculate just how much Bitcoin can help the renewable grid. But when it comes to, you can get precise calculations of, if you mine this much Bitcoin, this is how much carbon dioxide equivalent, this is how much methane would have gone into the air that will not go into the air. And if you have a fund, you can say, look, for every dollar that's going into this fund, for every dollar that's going into Bitcoin mining using carbon negative energy, this is how many tons of carbon dioxide equivalent are not going into the air. And these are not offsets. These are direct emission reductions.
That's big. That's big to put it the smoothest way I can mention. But having all of those incentives, right? And now that I am getting to know that topic better and deeper, thanks to you, the question that rings in my head is, will the governors truly get inspired by it as well, right? So, like, can the future really be green the way you see it?
What I see happening in the future is I don't see them getting it right 100%. In fact, I see them getting it wrong 50% and right 50%. And we've already seen some evidence of that. In the latest White House report that came out, you can divide the environmental benefits of Bitcoin in two. The benefits it has to stabilizing the grid, building out the renewable grid, stabilizing intermittency of renewable energy. We can talk about that benefit. And then we can talk about the benefits it has in terms of mitigating methane, preventing this 84 times worse greenhouse gas and carbon dioxide going into the air in the first place. Now, the challenge that the people who are in the solar and the wind area, and this is an incredible area and it has so much to offer in terms of a renewable build out, but the problem is it's harder to quantify that side of it, and it's easier to get the wrong end of the stick. When it comes to methane mitigation, of course, you have to understand how grids work, and grids are not simple. They're highly complex things. And it took me about 2 months of listening to podcasts and multiple times from people like Sean Connell from Lancium and all sorts of other people who were experts on the grid, and really diving deep into understanding it before I finally understood just all the nuances of how Bitcoin could help the grid. But a lot of people aren't going to dive that deep. They're not going to have that time. And whereas on the methane side, it's much easier. We've got existing metrics we can use to quantify how much methane it's mitigating, quantify its environmentally positive benefit. So what I see happening is that the government will get things wrong on the grid side and will come up with some terrible conclusions. They will fail to take into consideration that it's a non-rival user. They will continue to come to the misunderstanding that Bitcoin has created problems with supply of electricity in the first place, which it absolutely has not, because it's created more renewables on the grid and it uses them in a non-rival way. But I think they'll continue to get it right when it comes to the methane mitigation side. The EPA is very warm to this idea. The EPA understand only too well that regulation is the last strategy you use to try and institute environmental change when all other strategies, such as incentivizing, have failed. And so when the possibility of, in fact, even on the EPA website, they ask the question, why aren't there more people trying to use and incentivize a commercial application which takes landfill gas and combusts it for electricity? Why not? Well, the answer is simple. It didn't make economic sense until Bitcoin mining came along. Now it does. And now they have a remedy. And now they don't have to go around yielding the stick of regulation and trying to put up flare stacks with all the problems they have and all the inefficiencies and all the money that costs and all the defiance that a lot of landfill operators will have in return. Now they actually they can use the carrot, not the stick, which is going to be way more effective. It's going to mitigate a whole lot more methane. It's going to spread much faster, and it's going to provide money back to the communities, the municipalities, the land who now have an asset rather than a liability. So I see two things. I don't think that's going to be 100% good or 100% bad with the government. But what I do see happening is that the future increasingly of the whole Bitcoin network will get driven more and more to the things that regulators can wrap their heads around, and that's going to be vented methane.
Gotcha. It makes sense, and I think what I also kind of like wanted to ask or get a little bit of answer. I think many traders, as I interact with quite a broader audience of traders as well on a daily basis, we tend to see similar, of course, patterns at times, and there is this average trader profile, if you will, right, who trades Bitcoin or Ethereum, which is, of course, having this ETH merge 2.0 coming up, which is yet another story. But why should I, as an average trader, right, who just commits, at times more trades a day or fewer trades a day, why should we trade? Why should we care even about, this environmental impact of Bitcoin? Like, what's the hook there?
Yeah. Well, I think as a short-term trader, you don't have to care. That's the simple answer. Over time, however, depending on the nature of those trades, if you're going long over a period of time, or you want to take a directional bet, which is looking well into the future, particularly in a bear market, it's really important that you have an understanding of not just what's happening with derivatives, but what's happening with mining. And it's the more that you're looking at where the energy is coming from, that starts to, you can't start to understand that without also understanding the nuances of how the Bitcoin miners are doing. And we've already seen that a miner capitulation recently had quite an impact on Bitcoin price. Now, if you're talking to miners on a regular basis, you can get a sense of when that capitulation is going to happen. Now, you don't have to be talking to miners on a regular basis, but you should be listening to people who are, who can give you basically some alpha on that, because what's not well understood, sometimes people say, oh, below this threshold, mining isn't profitable. And it's not that broad brushstrokes. You actually have 4 different categories of miners. You have retail miners who are doing it from home. They've bought an S9 ages ago, or maybe an S19 Pro, and they're mining Bitcoin at home, unprofitably. In many cases, simply because they want to help the network. Or maybe they're using that heat in some way to heat their tower rack, or to heat their home, or their bunker. No, seriously, people are doing this stuff, and they've worked out that the Bitcoin mining isn't profitable because they've done the spreadsheet, not at today's Bitcoin prices, not off retail electricity rates. But they worked out, hey, if I can do something with that electricity, with that heat that I'm producing, then I've got an ancillary revenue source, and now it is profitable. So people are starting to try to do that. So you've got the retail miners. They're already underwater. Then you've got the commercial miners, and they fall into 2 categories, commercial and commercial hosted. The ones that know the IT side, they know the networking side, and they're doing all their own hosting. And the ones who say, forget that, give me an outsourced partner who's going to handle the hosting at a fixed rate. And the ones who are doing it themselves will have a slightly better, more forgiving liquidation price than the ones who are having to pay not only the electricity cost, but the hosting cost as well, because that's fixed, and they can't simply handle that with labor. So they have less flexibility. And then you have the enterprise miners, the Marathons, the Riots of this world, who have a business model where they are procuring ASICs at the cheapest price they possibly can because of their economies of scale. And they're also procuring the cheapest electricity prices they possibly can because of their economies of scale. And they can get it for prices which are 4 cents per kilowatt hour, 3 cents per kilowatt hour, less than 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So incredibly cheap wholesale electricity. And they have a liquidation price of Bitcoin which is less than $10,000 US. So they're still above water. Now, does that mean they're going to be profitable in a given month? Well, not necessarily, because you can have climate events. You can have extreme weather conditions that knock out your supply. There's a whole range of factors that can happen. You can have supply chain issues. But in theory, you have the ability to still be profitable even at a $10,000 mark. And so once you understand these different thresholds, you can kind of work out, okay, there's going to be a whole lot of miners who are going to get wrecked. The retail miners, they're going to be the first ones to go. They got wrecked about 32,000. Then you're going to get some of the commercial hosted ones that get wrecked. And you can understand what's the 3 phases that are going to happen. This is people who want to go deep into it. First phase is what? They're going to sell their Bitcoin. Second phase is they've sold some Bitcoin. So that's driven the price down. Because the price has gone down, that's caused a chain reaction where now it's even less profitable to mine, which causes a second liquidation, which is they have to liquidate their stock, their miners. They actually switch off because now it's no longer profitable to mine, and they try and recoup some of it by selling their ASICs. But they're selling into a market which has a glut. So the price of ASICs has gone down to about a third of what it was. So they're selling at the worst time possible, which means now some of them are at risk of having to exit their wholesale electricity agreements. And so now it's going to have an impact on hash rate. The hash rate's going to go down a little bit. You're going to have more miners. And once they liquidate those wholesale electricity agreements, they've had to break a contract. They've had to break a legal contract. And they're unlikely to come back into doing mining for a long time because those people on the grid are going to remember that they broke a contract and they'll be black marked. So again, having an understanding of these things can really help to work out at different bear market phases, what's going to be a downward pressure on Bitcoin price. And then you can look at the hash rate as well, and you can start to understand where it's recovering, where it's coming from. If you have an idea of who's buying ASICs when, again, that can give you an idea. And you can look at the difference between, because over time, price and hash rate always correlate very strongly, or they have since 2017. You can basically do this beautiful chart, and if you map the peaks of hash rate, it's this beautiful linear shape from 2017 onwards. And so it doesn't look correlated, but over the long time, the peak of the hash rate actually correlates very strongly with the trough of Bitcoin price. And every now and then it gets a little bit out of sync. And sometimes hash rate runs ahead, like it is now. Hash rate's going up, but Bitcoin price is going down. That's going to mean a lot of pain for the miners. And sometimes it's the other way around. And that's when, like, for example, when the miners went offline in China, even though the Bitcoin price went down, the hash rate went down as well. So the miners were actually insulated. So there wasn't a liquidation that occurred then. So what I would say is that understanding mining, definitely, and if you're interested in the environment, you end up learning a lot about mining by default, and that can have an influence on your trading. The other thing that I'd say going long, though, and this is not so much that this doesn't affect day to day, but long term, Bitcoin prices, we all know, is going to be driven by user adoption. So the other really critical thing to understand is that what's going to drive user adoption? Well, two things: greater regulatory clarity and greater ESG clarity. Now, a lot of people will say, well, ESG, it's a sham. And yeah, there's valid cause to say that. When ESG analysts come out and say that Exxon gets a stamp of ESG approval, but Bitcoin doesn't, then that undermines the credibility of ESG, not the credibility of Bitcoin. But we live in a world where we have $16 trillion of institutional capital that is earmarked to ESG funds. Unless that ticks the ESG boxes, it's not going to be unleashed on Bitcoin. Now, all 16 trillion isn't going to be unleashed on Bitcoin, but even 3% or 5% will have a big impact on supply and demand. And so again, every time that an institutional investor or even a single person gets orange pilled because they now understand that Bitcoin is not a net environmental negative, then that's one extra person who has helped to turn the tide against the FUD, against the misinformation. And you can almost start to gauge when the narrative changes. And the narrative is starting to change. And when the narrative starts to change and people understand the real story about Bitcoin, not the false story propagated by people who have vested interests to spread misinformation and to stir up confusion, but the real story about the positives that it can do, not that it's to defend it against being negative, that's a booby prize. Actually, the positive environmental story, that's going to drive institutional adoption, and that's going to drive hyper-Bitcoinization. So that's a long answer to your question, but I've got to be honest, I don't think it's going to affect day trading that much. But in the longer term, it will have an impact, and it's in everyone's interests to be able to know the narrative well enough that when people come at us with that FUD, we can point them in the right direction or give a simple answer and say, actually, no. I understand why you might have thought that, but here's the real picture, backed up by the data, not by non-investigative journalism.
Well, that is completely 180-degree different view than what you typically find on the internet. I completely agree with that. And well, Daniel, I mean, there's so many questions. So it almost gives this impression that we'll have to follow up with another interview in some time to get a full bank actually done. But appreciating so much of your generosity of time and wealth of knowledge so far. I definitely don't want to drag you for much longer or respect your time. But if we were to get close to the wrap up, with a little bit of some mental framework, some anchors, some numbers to take away, some most important numbers and figures that could help, for all the viewers to perhaps get a little bit more inspired, to dig deeper into this topic and down the rabbit hole of environmental impact of Bitcoin.
Yeah, so I'll give you some numbers here. So I think in megawatts, but I'll translate into miners what that means. So I'll start in megawatts. So at the moment, a single Bitcoin miner, an S19 Pro, that'll take 3.25 kilowatts. So if you have around about 300 of them, then that'll take up a megawatt. Now, if you have 3 megawatts, so in other words, about 923 S19 Pros, and if you are mining off vented methane, that 923 S19 Pros will make the entire Bitcoin network 1% less carbon intensive. It's crazy. That's such a small amount of miners.
Whoa.
If you were to have used flared gas, then you wouldn't need 3 megawatts, you'd need 37 megawatts. And if you were to have used renewable energy, which is displacing fossil fuel, you wouldn't have needed 37, you would have needed 75. So that gives you an idea of, in our paths to net zero emissions as a network, it's night and day about what's going to get us there the fastest. And there's another statistic, which is that right now, we already have 151 megawatts of power coming from vented methane gas. Now, that's good. It's not quite as great for the environment as vented, because when you're using flare, you've got to remember those flare stacks are eliminating a lot of the methane, not all of it. Now, if we had the same amount, just a little bit more than 150 megawatts, so 187 megawatts of power coming from vented methane. So from farms, from wastewater, orphan oil wells, landfills that were previously vented. And remember, 1 megawatt is around 300 S19 Pros. So it's not a lot of miners. That 187 megawatts would be enough to make the entire Bitcoin network carbon neutral. And remember, we've already got close to that amount of energy coming from flared methane already, so that's well achievable. And that's occurred in 2 years. So when I'm looking at the trend lines, I'm putting together the trend lines, and people saying that's unrealistic, it will never occur that fast. But the data's telling me, I've got to say what the data's telling me, not go on what I think sounds realistic. The data is telling me that we will hit carbon neutral in the fourth quarter of 2024. And then from that point onwards, we will become a carbon negative network. And if we continue, and the recent indication from that government report was favorable towards vented methane, remember, and not so favorable towards grid side, even though it should have been favorable to both, but that's the reality. That's only going to increase the acceleration, I believe, of the vented methane as a power source. If we can achieve just a quarter of the Bitcoin network's energy coming from vented methane in 2030, we will be carbon negative at least 10 times over. Of course, the final numbers depend on a whole range of factors such as hash rate, Bitcoin price, the usual suspects, but at least 10 times over carbon negative. And if you look at what that's doing for climate change, that would be enough to reduce the net emissions of the world by 2%. And those numbers are so staggeringly high because this is the only technology we've found to date that can sponge up that methane that's leaking from the sources where there's been no monetary incentive to sponge it up to date through any technology whatsoever.
Those are staggering, in fact. And ladies and gentlemen, I could probably go on and praise Daniel as I would. But apparently, if you think about that, it takes one person with a great knowledge, with great radio just like Daniel has, probably to kick off some new era, in my sim, for Bitcoin mining, for overall environmental impacts, and how not only good for the environment, but also profitable may be to get interested and dig down the rabbit hole about Bitcoin versus environmental impact. Ladies and gentlemen, well, my today's guest has been Daniel Batten. And before we disconnect, I want to perhaps we have this custom to share this one final tip with all of our viewers and listeners, and also where they can find you online feel free to take the stage, please.
Well, I just have to say that I consider myself one of many people who are pushing this forward. There's some incredible people, Troy Cross, Margot Paez, David Zell, Adam Wright at Vespine, who's leading the charge. Some incredible people who are doing work together, and we're all playing our piece. And I believe it's starting to have a real impact. Dennis Porter is doing some amazing work in terms of helping to mitigate some of the methane coming out of orphaned oil wells at the moment. And there just feels like a groundswell of people who are caring increasingly about this area. And then a lot of people like yourself who, as you say, haven't traditionally been asking this question. I'm finding that all the podcasters now are starting to ask the question. All the podcasters are saying, no, we've got to actually look at this and we've got to have some answers ready. So it feels like there's a tide starting to turn. I think it's early days. The mainstream news media narrative is still very anti-Bitcoin in the environment, but that will change. And it's an exciting time, and it'll have to change because the maths is undeniable. And 5 years' time, it won't even be a debate about the energy of Bitcoin at all. Maybe not even in 2 years.
I'm speechless for now. Speaking in favors of everybody who's listening to our podcast, Daniel, where can people find and learn more about you and what?
Just on Twitter, it's the best place. So, like you said, at DS Batten. And if they want to go deep into the weeds, I don't suggest you look at this unless you're really interested in. If you're a bit of a maths geek like me, but if you are, you're welcome to look at my reports. They find themselves on Batcoins. That's with a Z.com.
I love it. I love it. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Batten, once again, Bitcoin environmental analyst, climate tech VC coach advisor, and a great radio speaker, as it appears, has been our today's guest to actually talk and convince, well, me and many other people that it's really worth to take a little bit of a deeper look into an environmental impact, because also from an investment perspective, it may really yield interesting results over the time. Thank you so much for your generosity, again, for your wealth of knowledge. Daniel, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming over to today's podcast.
Hey, thanks for the invite. It was fun.
Let's make sure to bring it on in some time again. I'm really curious to continue the discussion. Talk Coin. Thank you so much once again, everybody. This has been Adrian CryptoBirb talking to you on today's The Nest Show podcast. And this is a wrap. And I see you guys on the next one. God bless. Bye-bye.